As a background to discussing capital, I'd like to outline aspects of the development of Marx's conception of the relation of philosophy and society. As is well known, Marx concludes his thesis on Feuerbach in 1845 with the statement that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it, thereby raising the issue of the relation of philosophy to society, and hence the relation of philosophy and social theory. This problematic is central to the thesis on Feuerbach, which begins by opposing materialism and idealism, whereas materialism, according to Marx, conceives of reality only in the form of the object. Idealism grasps the active, sensuous dimension, but does so in a manner abstracted from sensuous activity. Marx treats this opposition as expressing a subjective-objective dualism that has characterized modern Western philosophy. His aim is to overcome the dualism itself, which he claims can only be accomplished by an approach centered on sensuous human praxis. In so arguing, Marx obviously is not simply opposing action to thought. Neither, however, is he calling for a better philosophical understanding of the world. Criticizing Feuerbach for not seeing that the abstract individual which he analyzes belongs to a particular form of society, Marx suggests that the object of thought must be understood as historically and socially determinate. Moreover, and this is even more fundamental, not only the object of thought, but thought itself must be understood with reference to its context. Consequently, Marx criticizes the materialist doctrine that men are products of circumstances and upbringing, not only for forgetting the active dimension, that it is men who change circumstances, but also the reflexive dimension, that the educator must himself be educated. As a result, according to Marx, materialist doctrine ends up dividing society into two parts, one of which is superior to society. This critique is not only one of avant-gardist conceptions of politics, but also of any understanding of theory that explicitly or implicitly posits a decontextualized theorist hovering above and outside of all determinate contexts as an omniscient spirit. Overcoming the classic subject-object dualism, then, requires a self-reflexive form of thought that grasps philosophical problems with reference to their determinate social and historical context, while treating context as constituted by praxis. In other words, the approach Marx outlines in the theses on Feuerbach, although still underdetermined, regards critical social theory as the adequate supersession of philosophy. This general point emerges more clearly in the German ideology, where Marx famously argues that contrary to the idealism of the young Hegelians, it is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness. Nevertheless, Marx does not simply argue that the young Hegelians have made a conceptual error. Instead, he claims that their idealist understanding that consciousness determines life must itself be understood with reference to its context, or as he puts it, if in all ideology, men and their relations appear upside down, as in a camera obscura, this phenomenon arises from their historic life process. One task of critical theory, then, is to show that determinate forms of thought are forms of misrecognition by rendering them plausible with reference to their context. This critique, however, is not and cannot be undertaken from a standpoint that itself claims transhistorical validity. Within the framework of this approach, no theory, including Marx's, has such validity. This critique of a transhistorically valid truth does not, however, necessarily imply a radical relativism that ultimately is self-undermining. A theory can show itself to be both a rigorous theory of its context and historically specific if it reflexively can account for its own conditions of possibility by means of the same categories with which it grasps its own context. In this way, it can get beyond the opposition of universal decontextualized truth and relativism. In the German ideology, this approach is still largely programmatic. Marx only begins to work it out. So, for example, in discussing idealism, he relates its conditions of possibility in very general terms to the division of mental and manual labor. He also very generally relates the possibility of social critique to the contradictory nature of society, arguing that if theory comes into contradiction with existing relations, this can only occur because existing social relations have come into contradiction with existing productive forces. Although the notion of contradiction is not well developed here, it should be clear that it is crucial to the self-reflexive character of the critique. It grounds the possibility both of social critique as well as of historical transformation, and the two are related. Its significance in Marx's work cannot adequately be grasped objectivistically in terms of the problematic of economic crises, or subjectivistically simply in terms of social antagonism. It is in the Grundrisse and Kapital that Marx provides a firm foundation for a critical social theory capable of superseding philosophical thought by convincingly mediating it and its historical context. He does so by developing a conception of historically specific social forms. The Grundrisse helps illuminate Marx's critique of capitalist modernity in Kapital, which is more difficult to decipher inasmuch as it is tightly structured as a critique undertaken from a standpoint immanent to its object of investigation. For this reason, all too frequently, what is the object of Marx's critique has been regarded as its standpoint. In a crucial section of the Grundrisse titled "The Method of Political Economy," Marx wrestles with the question of an adequate point of departure for his critical analysis. He makes clear that the categories of his analysis should not be understood in narrow economic terms. Rather, they express the forms of being, Daseinsformen, the determinations of existence, Existenzbestimmungen, of this specific society. As such, they are at once forms of subjectivity and objectivity. They express what is given in the head as well as in reality. That is, Marx's categories grasp as intrinsically interrelated economic, social, and cultural dimensions of capitalist modernity that frequently are treated as contingently related. This categorical approach also contravenes understandings of the relation of social objectivity and subjectivity in terms of a base superstructure model. Moreover, Marx makes very clear that the categories of his critique are historically specific. Even categories that appear to be transhistorical and that actually do play a role much earlier historically, such as money and labor, are fully developed and come into their own only in capitalist society. As simple, abstract categories, according to Marx, they are as modern as are the relations which create this simple abstraction. That is, the abstract character of such categories is rooted in the abstract form of the social relations of capitalism, and it is precisely because of this abstract form that what is specific to capitalist society can appear to be transhistorical. Marx's emphasis on the historical specificity of the object of investigation is tied to the issue of the point of departure of his critical analysis. The historically specific character of the theory is not simply a matter of content, but also of form. The theory cannot present itself in transhistorical form, for example, as a universally valid method that simply can be applied to a variety of objects to which it is related only contingently. Rather, the historical specificity of the theory requires that the concept be the concept of its object. The point of departure of critical analysis, therefore, cannot be grounded in a Cartesian manner as a deduction from purportedly transhistorically valid truths. Rather, the point of departure must be historically specific, the core of a historically determinate analysis of the historically specific formation that is its context. Rather than presenting the categories in the order in which they arose historically, critical analysis, according to Marx, must begin with what is most essential to the determinate society it seeks to grasp. If Hegel, in the science of logic, was concerned with the problem of the point of departure for the exposition of a logic that doesn't presuppose a logic, that is, a grounding outside of that which it seeks to demonstrate, Marx was concerned with the problem of a historically specific point of departure for a rigorously immanent critical social theory, one that doesn't ground itself outside of its context. Such a point of departure can only be rendered plausible immanently by the course of its unfolding, whereby each successive unfolded moment retroactively justifies that which preceded it. And indeed, this is how Capital is structured. The categories of the beginning, for example, commodity, value, use value, abstract labor, concrete labor, are only really justified by the subsequent unfolding of the analysis. What appears to be their transhistorical grounding in the first chapter of Capital, in the form of a Cartesian deduction, should be understood within the framework of Marx's immanent mode of presentation. Understood in this way, what appears to be a transhistorical grounding of value is the way in which the subjective-objective forms present themselves. It is a meta-commentary on forms of thought that remain bound within the limits of the structuring forms of capitalist society. The historical specificity of the categories of Marx's critique also emerges clearly in another important section of the Grundrisse entitled Contradiction Between the Foundation of Bourgeois Production, Value as Measure, and its Development. There, Marx outlines what he regards as the essential core of capitalism and its fundamental contradiction. According to Marx here, the category of value expresses the social relations at the heart of capitalism as a form of social life. At the same time, it expresses a determinate form of wealth. Value generally has been understood as a category of the market. Yet Marx's characterization of value as the foundation of bourgeois production suggests it also should be understood as a category of capitalist production itself. This implies that the process of production should be seen as intrinsically related to capitalism. Let me elaborate. Value as a social form, according to Marx, is constituted by the expenditure of direct human labor in the process of production measured temporally. It expresses that which is and remains the underlying foundation of capitalist production. Yet production based on value generates a dynamic that gives rise to a growing tension between this foundation and the result of its own historical development. Capitalism generates enormous ongoing increases in productivity, as a result of which what Marx calls real wealth comes to depend less on labor time than on the general state of science and on the progress of technology. The contrast Marx draws between value and real wealth, between a form of wealth based on labor time and one that doesn't depend on immediate labor time and can be generated by knowledge, clearly indicates that value does not refer to social wealth in general, but is a historically specific form of wealth that is intrinsically related to a historically specific mode of production. Many arguments regarding Marx's analysis of the uniqueness of labor as a source of value overlook this distinction. The Grundrisse indicates, however, that it is irrelevant to argue for or against Marx's labor theory of value as if it were intended to be a theory of the unique properties of labor in general, rather than an analysis of the historical specificity of value as a form of wealth, and hence implicitly of the labor that constitutes it. In the Grundrisse, Marx argues that as the mode of production based on value develops, value becomes anachronistic in terms of the potential of the system of production to which it itself gave rise. The logic of the growing contradiction between real wealth and value implies the possibility of a different process of production, one no longer based on direct human labor. For Marx, then, overcoming capitalism involves the abolition of value as the social form of wealth, which in turn involves a fundamental transformation of the structure of social labor. Yet, although the course of capitalist development generates the possibility of a new liberating structure of social labor, its general realization is impossible under capitalism, according to Marx. Despite value's growing inadequacy as a measure of social wealth, it remains the necessary structural precondition of capitalist society, and this is the basis of capitalism's fundamental contradiction. Marx's notion of the structural contradiction of capitalism, then, should not be identified immediately with class conflict, nor does it refer most fundamentally to a contradiction between private appropriation and socialized production, since production itself is molded by capitalist relations. Rather, Marx's analysis locates a contradiction between the actuality of the form of production constituted by value and its potential, a potential that grounds the possibility of a new form of production. Relatedly, far from entailing the realization of the proletariat, overcoming capitalism would involve the material abolition of proletarian labor. Marx's critical theory, then, should be understood essentially as a critique of labor in capitalism rather than a critique of distribution from the standpoint of labor. At this point, I can briefly outline a reading of Capital based on the considerations developed thus far. As is well known, Capital's point of departure is the commodity. On the basis of the Grundrisse, it now is evidence that the category of the commodity here does not refer to commodities as they might exist in many societies, nor does it express a fictitious historical stage of simple commodity production purportedly antecedent to capitalism. Rather, the category of the commodity here is historically specific. It designates the most fundamental social form of capitalist society. The characteristics of that form, that it is simultaneously a value and a use value, should also be understood as historically specific. The commodity form is constituted by labor, according to Marx. He maintains that labor in capitalism has a double character. It is both concrete labor and abstract labor. Concrete labor is obvious. It refers to the fact that some form of what we call laboring activity mediates the interactions of humans with nature in all society. Abstract labor, however, does not simply refer to labor in general. Rather, it signifies that labor in capitalism has a historically unique social function that is not intrinsic to laboring activity as such. It serves as a kind of a quasi-objective means by which the products of others are acquired. Labor in capitalism not only mediates the interactions of humans and nature, then, but also constitutes a historically specific social mediation, according to Marx. Hence, its objectifications, commodity, capital, are both concrete labor products and objectified forms of social mediation. The social relations that most fundamentally characterize the capitalist form of social life are thus very different from the qualitatively heterogeneous social relations, such as kinship relations, that characterize other forms of social life. The fundamental forms of social relations constitutive of capitalism are peculiarly quasi-objective and formal, and are characterized by a dualistic opposition of an abstract general homogeneous dimension and a concrete particular material dimension, both of which appear to be natural rather than social. In Marx's mature works, then, the notion of the essential centrality of labor to social life should not be taken to mean that material production is the most essential dimension of life, or of social life in general, or even of capitalism. Rather, it refers to the historically specific constitution by labor in capitalism of a form of mediation that fundamentally characterizes that society. Because this mediating activity is not a characteristic intrinsic to laboring activity, it does not and cannot appear as such. Instead, when the commodity is analyzed, its historically specific dimension, value, appears to be constituted by labor in general without any further qualifications, the expenditure of human brain, muscles, nerves, hands, etc. In other words, within the framework of Marx's analysis, the concrete dimension both expresses and veils the abstract dimension, And as a result, what is historically specific, the socially mediating function of labor and capitalism, appears transhistorical, as socially ontological. This is an initial determination of what Marx refers to as the fetish forms of capitalism. It is the basis of all approaches that transhistoricize the socially constituting role of labor and capitalism, whether affirmatively, as in classical political economy and traditional Marxism, or negatively, as in the dialectic of enlightenment. The historically specific form of mediation at the heart of capitalism is constituted by determinate forms of practice, but becomes quasi-independent of the actors. The result is a new form of social domination, one that subjects people to increasingly impersonal, rational imperatives and constraints that cannot adequately be grasped in terms of the concrete domination of social groupings such as class or institutional agencies of the state or of the economy. Like power as conceptualized by Foucault, this form of domination has no determinate locus and appears not to be social at all. Moreover, it is not static, but temporally dynamic. In Capital, Marx treats the historically dynamic character of capitalism as historically specific, grounded in the double character of the underlying social forms of capitalism. It's crucially important to note in this regard that the distinction Marx makes in the Grundrisse between value and real wealth reappears in the first chapter of Capital as between value and material wealth. Material wealth is a function of a number of factors in addition to labor, such as knowledge, social organization, and natural conditions. Value, the dominant form of wealth in capitalism, is constituted by human labor time alone, according to Marx. Their dialectic, the dialectic of value and use value, becomes historically significant with the emergence of relative surplus value and gives rise to a very complex, nonlinear historical dynamic which underlies modern society. On the one hand, this dynamic is characterized by ongoing transformations of production and more generally of social life. On the other hand, this historical dynamic entails the ongoing reconstitution of its own fundamental condition as an unchanging feature of social life, namely that social mediation is ultimately effected by labor, and hence that living labor remains integral to the process of production regardless of the level of productivity. The historical dynamic of capitalism ceaselessly generates what is new while regenerating what is the same. This dynamic both generates the possibility of another organization of social life and yet hinders that possibility from being realized. Marx grasps this very complex historical dynamic with his category of capital. The historically specific abstract form of social domination intrinsic to capitalism, then, is the domination of people by time. This form of domination is bound to a historically specific abstract form of temporality, abstract Newtonian time, which is constituted historically with the commodity form. The temporality of capital's dynamic, however, is not only abstract. The dialectic of the value and use value dimensions changes the determination of what counts as a given unit of time. The movement here is not simply a movement in time, but it's a movement of time. And this I term historical time. Both abstract time and historical time are constituted historically as structures of domination. Within this social universe, people appear doubled. On the one hand, as commodity owners, they are subjects, free from relations of personal domination and equal to all other subjects. On the other hand, they are unfree, constrained by social forms of domination that appear external and objective. This historically specific double character of personhood in capitalism can be and has been transhistoricized and ontologized, for example, by Durkheim with his notion of homo duplex. The historical dynamic I've outlined is at the heart of capital, which Marx analyzes as self-valorizing value. Significantly, in introducing the category of capital in Kapital, Marx describes it with the same language that Hegel used to describe Geist in the Phenomenology, the self-moving substance that is the subject of its own process. In so doing, Marx suggests that a historical subject in the Hegelian sense does indeed exist in capitalism. Yet, and this is crucially important, he does not identify that subject with the proletariat or with humanity. Instead, he identifies it with capital. This implies that the so-called rational core of Hegel's dialectic is precisely its idealist character. It expresses capitalism's dynamic structure of social domination that acquires a quasi-independent existence vis-a-vis the people who constitute it. In his mature theory, then, Marx develops a position very different from that of theorists like Lukács, for whom the social totality constituted by labor provides the standpoint of the critique of capitalism and is to be realized in socialism. In Kapital, the totality and the labor constituting it have become the objects of critique. The contradictions of capital point to the abolition, not the realization of the subject. Within this framework, then, history, understood as an immanently driven directional dynamic, is not a universal category of human social life. Rather, it is a historically specific feature of capitalist society that can be and has been projected onto all of human life. By grounding this dynamic in the category of capital, this analysis treats it as a manifestation of heteronomy. In this evaluation, that is, of history as heteronomy, the critical Marxian position is, curiously enough, closer to post-structuralism than it is to orthodox Second International Marxism. Nevertheless, it doesn't regard heteronomous history as a narrative, which can simply be dispelled discursively, but as a structure of domination that must be overcome. From this point of view, any attempt to rescue human agency by focusing on contingencies in ways that bracket the existence of the structure of domination is ironically profoundly disempowering. I'm suggesting, in other words, that the category of capital allows for a position that can get beyond the dualistic opposition of a Hegelian transhistorical conception of history as necessity and its post-structuralist rejection in the name of contingency. The understanding of capitalism's complex dynamic I've outlined also allows, and this I of course cannot elaborate here, for a critical social rather than technological analysis of the form of growth and structure of production in modern society. In Kapital, Marx examines both as heteronymous forms that nevertheless embody emancipatory possibilities that remain unrealized under capitalism. Marx's analysis, then, seeks to grasp the course of capitalist development as a double-sided development of enrichment and impoverishment. The rapid increase in scientific and technical knowledge under capitalism does not signify linear progress towards emancipation. According to Marx's analysis, such increased knowledge, itself socially constituted, has led to the fragmentation and emptying of human labor and to the increasing control of humanity by the results of its own objectifying activity. Yet it has also increased the possibility that labor could be individually enriching and that humanity could exert greater control over its fate. This double-sided development is rooted in the double character of the structures of capitalist society with which Marx begins Capital. By indicating that the potential of the system of production developed under capitalism could be used to transform that system itself, this analysis grasps the opposition of a linear faith in progress and its romantic rejection as expressing another historical antinomy that in both of its terms is characteristic of the capitalist epoch. Marx's critical theory points to the possibility that what was historically constituted in alienated form could be appropriated and hence fundamentally transformed. This possibility is given by the historical emergence of a gap between society as it is, molded by capital, and society as it could be, given the possibilities generated by capital itself. This gap, which indicates that the whole is not unitary, opens the space for critical reflection, not on the basis of what is presumed to be ontological, but on the basis of a growing contradiction between what is and what could be. In other words, the critical theory of capitalism can elucidate its own condition of possibility by means of the same categories with which it seeks to grasp its object. Unlike some other critical theories, it doesn't accord itself a privileged position that implicitly is an exception to what it critically describes. The thrust of the critique of capitalism is to point toward the possibility of the overcoming of capitalism's quasi-automatic historical dynamic, which means towards the possibility that people could finally become the subjects of their own history. With the realization of that possibility, the critical theory would have lost its object and hence its own validity. Thank you.